to the VT Club. The VT Club podcast. I'm Jeff Evans. I'm here with my co-host Michael Berry, and also the co-president of VT Club. And today's guest is Meagan Roy, who has had a number of roles in education. We'll let her tell you about that. But the reason for her visiting today is her role with the Commission on the Future of Public Education in Vermont. So Meagan, welcome. Thanks for coming. And please start by talking a little bit about your educational journey and what landed you where you are at the moment.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for having me. So I'm Meagan Roy, and my journey, I'm a special educator by trade. I was an intensive needs special educator, meaning I worked with kids with low incidence and complex disabilities. And what I learned pretty quickly is that public school doesn't always work for every kind of learner. And while I could do what I hoped was a good job with individual kids on my caseload, what we really need to do in order to make it work for more kids is to work on the system. So that's really what got me interested in leadership. I spent most of my career actually as a special ed director. And while I was special ed director, also started to be really interested in policy and how policy informs leadership and what we do in schools, and how do you create policy that makes schools better for all kids. I spent some time as a superintendent, and I am now in the school leadership program at St. Michael's College, teaching and working with future leaders. And I think here today, because I also find myself as the chair of the Commission on the Future of Public Education in Vermont.
Well said. Can you talk a little bit more about the commission, why it was formed, how you became the chair, and what you see your role as the chair is?
Sure. In terms of why the commission was formed, I think it is really clear to everyone that the tipping point for the commission is the intractable budget situation that we found ourselves in last year. The passage of Act 127, the huge increase in property taxes, the really challenging budget season was really clear to the legislature that we need to do something different heading into this year. But there's also a recognition that it's a really complicated issue. And if the solution was ready for us, it would have been implemented. And so the commission was convened as part of the yield bill at the end of last session. The yield bill is usually a technical bill that tells us that final number that tells us what our tax rate will be. And this time, the yield bill convened the commission. I can talk a little bit more in a minute about sort of what its charge is, but how I became chair, frankly, I'm on the commission because I was the former chair of the Act 173 advisory group and was excited to be part of defining the future of public ed in Vermont. It's a really complicated but interesting policy challenge. The law asks that the House of Representatives and the Senate jointly agree on a chair. And I didn't know that. I didn't read that part of the law all that closely at the time. And not very long before the first meeting of the commission, I got a phone call, and I suspect that they had a list of people who they were looking at, and I suspect many of them said no. So I was named the chair. I did not necessarily volunteer, although I did say yes, cautiously. And here's why. I don't mean to be tongue-in-cheek about it, but it's really important work, and it's an enormous charge. I'm not exactly sure if we can completely meet the charge, but we need to try. And I see my role as chair as trying to get us to that conversation, trying to figure out how to get these 13 people, I'm one of the 13, who all are representative of either an organization or an entity with really specific positions about these issues. I see my role as trying to get us to a place where we can have a cohesive conversation and hopefully land in consensus. It is a little different than I thought my role would be. I thought I would be a participant. Being chair is a little less sharing what I think about it and a little bit more navigating the process.
Yeah, so speaking of the charge, before we jump into some of the underlying challenges that live within the work that the commission's doing, what is the charge? And then is there a timeline for some of this work?
Sure. The charge officially, and I'll actually read it. The commission shall study the provision of education in Vermont and make recommendations for a statewide vision for Vermont's public education system to ensure that all students are afforded substantially equal and educational opportunities in an efficient, sustainable, and stable education system. That's the charge. The specific areas that we are asked to make policy recommendations in is the education finance system, education governance, resources, and administration, and the physical size and footprint of the education system. And timeline, sorry. I was just rereading the question. So the timeline, officially the commission goes through December of 2025 and delivers its final report in December of 2025. So it's a little over 18 months because it was convened in July of this past year. But we also have to provide preliminary cost containment recommendations to the General Assembly by this December, so December 2024, in advance of this coming legislative session. So the timeline is more than ambitious. What I would think makes it most ambitious is that the reason it has an 18-month time frame is because it's an incredibly complex issue. And yet we also have to give some recommendations in 3 months. And in order to deeply engage different perspectives across the state, there is a lot of public input requirement written into the law. In order to do that, it takes time. That timeline does not necessarily match with this initial timeline of December, but that's what we're aiming for. Preliminary recommendations by December of 2024, final recommendations by December of 2025, and then the commission ceases to exist after that.
So you mentioned getting input, which is much easier said than done. What are some of the strategies that the commission is using to gather input?
Yeah, so this is an area that really early in the process, in fact, before our first meeting, it was really clear. It's not only written in the law to engage various perspectives. There's some there's a list of entities that the commission is responsible for interacting with. But the point is to gather a lot of input. It's also a committee of 13, and the positions are named in the law. And so I would offer and have said at meetings before, it is not representative of Vermont fully. The legislature wanted to represent positions, organizations, entities, but it is not representative of the state. And whenever something is not representative in terms of the people at the table, it means the people at the table need to do yeoman's work to get those perspectives in. That's something that's really important to me as the chair, and not just because it's in the law. It's important to me because if we want this commission to be trusted, we have to demonstrate that we are gathering a lot of input, looking at a lot of data. So the commission has chosen to do that work by creating a communication and engagement subcommittee. That was one of the very first subcommittees to kick off. They have proposed a communication and engagement plan with the goal, 3 goals actually, to share information widely so that people really understand the issues, to listen and gather input and feedback, and to make sure that that is an engagement level of feedback, not just to hear what you think. So we have a subcommittee. The subcommittee has drafted a request for proposals because we will be consulting or hiring a consultant to support the commission, someone with expertise in equitable community engagement and an organization that knows how to seek voices that are not typically at the table and bring them to the forefront. So that is the work so far. We have our request for proposal went out last week, and we hope to secure a consultant pretty quickly.
Thank you. So let's jump into the challenges, of which there are many. And I just recently read something that our old district, the superintendent there sent out to his stakeholders and constituents about the upcoming budget season, and said basically if they level funded everything where it was this year, it would be an over $5 million cut to the budget, I think was the number. And that would be 50 something positions, let's say. And so that would be a total of 92 positions over the past 2 years. So that's the economic reality staring one district in the face. Given that, talk about some of the challenges around cost containment. And at the same time, we're talking about improving student outcomes. And so it feels like there's this dissonance happening around do better with less. Yeah, I'm going to stop there and let you talk.
Yeah, well, you've kind of nailed it or nailed the impossibility of it. I would describe it this way. So in Vermont, our education finance system is a shared system, which means we all share in the decision-making of local districts, but the decision-making is local. So Vermont has a tradition of local, very close to the community way of making decisions. And so individual districts, school boards, administrators, communities propose and hopefully adopt and vote in their budget, but that then the costs voted in those budgets all are shared by the state because the money that we collect from property taxes goes into the education fund and then gets distributed back out. That means that the financial challenge that we are in, which really did come to a head last spring in sort of a perfect storm. We have high property values. So the technical way that we compute our property tax is impacted by that. School districts have no control over that element. Spending, which districts do have control over, is connected. We have incredibly high and rising personnel costs. It's not a surprise to those in the field that Vermont delivers education in a way with a lot of personnel that looks different than the rest of the country. And personnel costs are high. Healthcare costs are high. So we have cost drivers. We have the things that make that complicated. And then we have decision-making about those things. And decision-making is everything from administrators in districts deciding how many adults they need to serve the kids that they serve, but it also includes boards and communities deciding how many schools they will choose to operate and how big are those schools. And we have cost drivers in capital projects. So I could go on and on about the cost drivers, but what makes this issue so complex is that the decision that I make in a district over here is impacted and is also probably different from the decision that someone makes over here. We have various folks who want to focus in on cost containment, and cost containment works, except that there are then there's a lot of local control around the instructional decision making that we make. So you talked about how do we make sure that our schools can serve the kids that come through our doors, and those kids are not uncomplicated, as you know. We need some amount of uniformity and adherence to best practice. But in our state, those are done through guidelines, guidance, and recommendations. They're not done by mandates. So that's that decision-making, governance, accountability thread or lever I've been referring to it as. because all of these three things interact together. How many schools we serve, how we choose to serve our students, who chooses to do those things, and then how much it costs. And then all of that is shared. And that really is the ultimate piece of this that is why we're having this conversation, because the decisions one district makes really does impact or do impact others.
So a couple things in there. To what extent will the commission look at study other states' models? Because while Vermont is unique in terms of its adherence to local control, some of that was the byproduct of the rural nature and of the geography, and taking the approach of making larger systems that other schools currently have may not realize the same kind of efficiencies. So how influenced are you by what others are doing?
I think we have to be influenced by both ideas that have come and been discussed here within Vermont, and also what other states are doing. I think Vermont, and maybe this is not unique to Vermont, but Vermont believes itself to be incredibly unique. And I'm not sure that we are as unique as we think we are. And so not only do I think we need to look at other state solutions, but we have been asked as a commission to make sure that we are looking at other solutions, because there isn't a need to reinvent the wheel. That said, there are some things, some challenges that Vermont has that are unique. And the goal of the commission is really to thoughtfully consider lots of options, but not in a way that grinds our work to a halt. I think there's a limit to, there are folks who would love to just study this issue forever. There are also some folks that believe the commission itself is too much study, and they think that we already had the solutions. So somewhere in between is the right amount of data to look at, the right amount of ideas to consider and frankly reconsider, and do our due diligence to those things, but not get stuck. Because members of these aren't my words, but members of the commission's finance subcommittee have pointed out lots of solutions have been on the table in the past number of years. This is not a new issue. And some of those solutions touch on the finance system. How do we raise and spend our money? They touch on governance, who makes decisions. And that's everything from the role of the agency, role of the state board, and also what's the right footprint. It touches on all of those things. But for each of those solutions, they hit what I keep saying is a third rail for some group. And there are different third rails. And part of our challenge is that we've not landed on some of those difficult decisions because they touch on a really sensitive thing for one group or another.
And the last follow-up I'll ask is, to what degree or what kind of impacts to Act 46 consolidation, the Brigham decision, have on the work that you're doing? Because the solutions you must brainstorm, co-create, have to live within those confines. And yet, to your point, lots of those solutions have already been developed and suggested, and they ran into these third rails. So how do you do the work within those confines and those influences?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing I'd say is I'd start with the Brigham decision. So the Brigham decision made really clear, first of all, I'll back up because this element was pointed out in the Brigham decision, but it wasn't created by the Brigham decision. Vermont's Constitution defines the state as the entity responsible for public education. It is the state's responsibility. And Brigham highlighted that responsibility and pointed out that we choose to delegate that responsibility to local districts, but that is a choice. The ultimate entity responsible is the state. But Brigham also centered equity. So where someone lives and the property value and socioeconomic value level of that community should not define the quality of their education. That's the crux of Brigham. And one thing that the commission did is adopt a set of guiding principles so that every proposal that comes to them is going to be vetted through those guiding principles. And that principle of equity, and equity as sort of talked about in Brigham, is central. So the principles are, first of all, the commission recognizes that education is a state responsibility, and it acknowledges that Vermont has a tradition of local control, and those two things run up against each other. It doesn't have a solution to that. It just acknowledges it. But then the three principles is equity. And the commission does not attempt to define equity. That's really complicated, but it is committed to these core understandings, which is that equity does not mean equal, that solutions with an equity focus have to be differentiated by need, and that when you think about equity, you have to think of both inputs, so what do kids have access to, and outputs, which is outcome. So they're committed to equity, they're committed to quality. How do we define a quality education? So that kind of gets to what you were saying, Jeff. And then frankly, sustainability and affordability, because we wouldn't be here if we were spending a lot of money and receiving the outcomes that we wanted. We may or may not be here, but right now, being affordable for Vermonters is a core piece. So those are our principles. And I think when it comes to Act 46, we have to understand the constraints that exist in Vermont. Act 46 was an attempt to consolidate, but it was primarily a governance consolidation. And so there's a lot that's been said lately about, well, it didn't save as much money as you all said that it would, but functionally it reduced the number of school boards we have. It did not largely change how we deliver education and the number of schools. And so we're going to have to talk about that in the context of our principles.
Thank you.
This next question is just a softball that Jeff tossed in here. Can you forecast the upcoming legislative session, and how is the work of the commission going to influence that or not? A super simple question, I think.
Yeah, super simple. Thanks for that one. I would never attempt to predict what the General Assembly will do. What I know, though, is that they will do something. We can't, Vermont is really, the budget problem really is intractable. I mean, property tax increases are significant, and that's an understatement. So I am confident that something will be done. And my fear, frankly, is that it will be done without any context for how complex it is. And so as hard as it is for this commission to have preliminary recommendations by December, we're really going to try. Even if what we produce is not consensus level recommendations, it's still important to surface what are the ideas, what is it the commission looked at to get to those ideas, how come they didn't land in consensus? I mean, I'm trying not to get ahead of the process, but I think we have to really try, because something will happen this legislative session. It is supposed to be ideally short-term cost containment measures, but the challenge is there aren't a whole lot of short-term things that we can do without a complete overhaul of our finance system that also touches on governance and footprint. So we've been talking this whole time about how complex that is. So that would be it's not a forecast. It's an acknowledgement that something will happen, and the commission, we need to do the best we can to give the legislature something to work with so that they can take that into their deliberations.
Thanks. So we talked a little bit about input, but just talk now about how the work goes beyond just the commission.
He was probably going to say something really profound, and he froze. I think what he was going to talk about. Oh, are you back?
I'm back. Yes.
Go for it.
So just talk about engaging, the field in this process a little bit. You know the question. Go ahead.
Yep. Perfect. So I would say two things. One, even when we hire a communication and engagement consultant, and even when we lean into input, we still have an incredibly short timeline, which means we need to maximize input opportunities that already exist. And we need to maximize our communication with our trusted colleagues, especially in education, that already have really good insight. And that's curriculum leaders, that's special ed directors, that's superintendents, and some of those entities are represented on the commission, but some of them aren't. So one of the things that I would say for folks in general is to stay engaged with the process if they have interest, to look to their statewide organizations, because it is our goal to capitalize on input opportunities as they come up, and then using that information. So even if for example, the VTCLA, your fall meeting, it's only one opportunity, but it's an opportunity. And so we intend to capitalize on those. The other thing that I would say for kind of like educators, administrators, folks engaged in this work, especially around budget planning, is honestly to keep an open mind and to exude that open mind when they talk to others in our communities, because no matter what comes out of this, it is going to result in a really difficult decision that hits on someone's third rail. Actually, I think we'll do our work if it touches on everyone's third rail. And that brings up a lot of emotions. It brings up a lot of feelings. I think there is this idea that if you fix just one thing, and as long as it's not the thing I care about, I'm okay with it. But the reality is one of these levers is not going to fix it. It's going to be all of them. So I would encourage folks to keep an open mind, because what I worry about and what many folks worry about in this is the degrading of public opinion about public education as a result of this process. And so those of us in public education, unfortunately, we have to defend it. And sometimes defending it can say, yeah, I know this issue was really important to you, and it looks like it might go in this direction. It's not because public schools are terrible. So I have this kind of existential fear about defending public ed, and I would want our folks to be champions of public ed, which is hard to do right now.
Well said. This has been really helpful, Meagan. We'd like to kind of wrap things up by giving our guests a chance to shout out to somebody in education that's been inspirational to them or support to them. And you're certainly taking on a very interesting role. So, I mean, this could be a great time to shout out to somebody for supporting you in your education work. Who would you pick?
I appreciate that. I was glad I got this question ahead of time, but it didn't give me any more ability to pick a single name. So what I would say, and I could say something joking about an individual who nominated me to be the chair of the Act 173 Commission, which was supposed to be a 12-month thing. And that one was 4 years. And now that's the reason I'm here. So I could make a snarky comment about that. But actually, I would shout out, right now, there are an immense number of educational leaders working in really challenging circumstances. And, having recently stepped out of public ed and into the space of trying to develop leaders and help new leaders get excited about doing a really hard job, I would shout out to the people doing those hard jobs, because there aren't enough of us. The work is hard and it's often thankless. And so I would just say, I just had a couple of meetings today and this week with just administrators doing the best that they can in a really difficult time. So I'm kind of shouting out to education leaders that are still in the thick of it. And thank you, all of you.
Thank you very much. Meagan, this has been great. We'll continue the conversation, I'm sure. We look forward to seeing the work that the commission produces and what kind of influences it'll have on the decisions that are being made in the future. We don't envy you these decisions, but I, at least speaking personally, am glad that you are deeply engaged in those decisions. It gives me more confidence in the outcome.
Thanks to both of you, and thanks for keeping this going, because it's a good thing to stay connected to, even though it feels really ethereal.
Hey, well, thank you very much.
Thanks.